So here we are. We are now going to look at the Fair Competition Act of 1993. We would have looked at the Consumer Protection Act of 2005 on the last occasion, and this is our final slide, our final series of lectures dealing with consumer protection and competition. And the important point to note is that the Fair Competition Act also includes provisions relating to consumer protection, but more importantly, it deals with fair competition. And what we have been concerned with in these legislation are the requirements of the Act in relation to consumers and their protection and in relation to competition, and we are also interested in the commissions that have been set up by the Act and the rules of those commissions, the powers and the function of those commissions, as well as what is prohibited by the Acts and what penalties, if any, or what sanctions, if any, are applicable. So the Act itself, as you can see, relates to the whole process of competition, and there's a historical context where that is concerned, because 1993 one could say was a watershed area or watershed period in relation to competition in Jamaica, where there was a shift away from state organized economic activities to more private sector activities, and this shift would have started in the 1980s, accelerated in 1989 and in 1993, when globally the orthodoxy at the time was about a minimalist state and the private sector becoming the engine of growth. So as the public sector or the government or the state retreated from production, it then needed to become the regulator of the market, because as we would have seen in 2008, if we fast forward to that period, an unbridled market, unregulated market can bring about undesired outcomes. And again in 1997 there was a shift in relation to the thinking that the market itself was sufficient to what is referred to in literature as an activist state. So part of the activism of the state is not that they went back into the market or went back into production, but that they became more regulatory and also facilitatory in terms of policies that would stimulate economic growth and stimulate the private sector. So what are the objectives of the Act? The first, of course, as we can see there, is to encourage competition in the conduct of trade and business. And then the second is to ensure that all legitimate business enterprises have an equal opportunity to participate in the economy. So again, coming back to the point I made earlier, that the state is seeking to play the role of a referee, if one wants to use that analogy. And then C indicates that provide consumers with better products and services, a wide range of choices at the best possible price. So, remember I indicated that for the Fair Competition Act, we're talking about two limbs, one dealing with fair competition, and the second one, of course, dealing with consumer protection. So as part of consumer protection, the quality of products, quality of service, in a free market enterprise, choice is critical, but also at the best possible prices. So, underscoring the point I made again earlier, to achieve these Objectives: the act can be seen in two contexts: anti-competitive practices and then the provisions that deal with consumer protection. So the establishment of the commission, and here the Act Section 4 establishes the Fair Trade Commission, and the Fair Trade Commission is the body that is responsible for implementing the Fair Competition Act, or put differently, to ensure that the players in the market are abiding by the rules as set out in the fair competition legislation. So part 2 looks at the Fair Trade Commission, and section 4 subsection 1 gives us the establishment of the Fair Trading Commission, and what you will see there is that the language there is similar to the language used in the Consumer Protection Act, where the Consumer Affairs Commission was set up, and it is a body corporate, which means that it has separate legal personality. Reference is made to section 28 of the Interpretation Act, which tells us what a statutory body is. And as I've said before, that is a body corporate, which means that the commission is separate from the natural persons. So the commission is an artificial or unnatural person, and therefore they have rights that are akin to that of persons. They can enter into contracts, they can sue on contracts, they can initiate suits or be sued in their own name, right? So as with the various pieces of legislation, there are schedules that are attached to them, and the schedules will speak about how the commission is operated, how it runs internally, and that schedule can be contains the constitution of the commission and will give the persons who are in charge of the day-to-day operations of the commission the powers that will allow them to take decisions and to guide the work of the commission. So section 5 of the Act speaks about the functions of the commission. And what are these functions? Well, first, our function number 1, to carry out on its own request of any person investigations and inquiries in relation to the conduct of business in order to determine if any enterprises engaging in business practices in contravention of the Act. So investigation is high on the agenda or the priority of the Fair Trade Commission, and of course it can initiate investigations itself, again coming back to the corporate nature of it, or if a member of the public or a company or a business person makes a request of them, then in those circumstances they can investigate. The second function is also investigative, and this is if the minister who is responsible makes a request of the commission to carry out such investigation. Then in those circumstances the commission can enter upon the reference as well. Then it has an advisory function, as we can see here in item 3, and this is to advise the minister in relation to the operations of the Act. And by the minister here, we're talking about the minister who is responsible for commerce and trade. Then the fourth one is also investigative, and this can either be at its own initiative or at the request of any person who is affected adversely, but this is specific in relation now to the abuse of a dominant position by any enterprise, And when we get to section 20, section 21 will look at what is meant by abuse of dominant position. But if there is a charge against a company that they are abusing their dominant position in the market, then the commission can investigate. And it is instructive that one of the most active sector in which this function has been brought into use is in the telecommunication sector. Tussles between Digicel and then cable and wireless, then Lime, then Flow in relation to who is abusing market dominance. Then the fifth function of the commission is to carry out any other duties prescribed or pursuant to the act. So this is an omnibus clause. So again, these functions are not exhaustive, I would argue, but if it relates and touches on concern, competition, and any violation, then the commission has locus standi. So we spoke about the commission. The question now, what are the roles of the commissioners? What are the functions of the commissioners? And the function of the commissioners are outlined here. And they must make themselves available to persons who are engaged in business. So, one, general information with respect to their rights and obligations under the Act. And these are business persons or companies who may be affected by the Act. So, again, another role that the commissioner play is that they are to provide guidance of consumers, provide general information with respect to the rights and obligation of persons under the act affecting the interest of consumers. So here again, this is the second function of the commissioners. So in one instance, making themselves available to persons who are in business, whether they are company or individuals, and they are to provide them with information in relation to their obligations under the act, and here to provide consumers with guidance in relation to what their rights are. The third is to undertake studies and publish reports and information regarding matters that affect the interest of consumers. And then, of course, they are also to cooperate. So this is the fourth function: cooperate and assist any association or body of persons in developing and promoting the observation of standards of conduct for the purpose of ensuring compliance with the provisions of the Act. So again, just as how in the Consumer Protection Act we have an encouragement of civil society groups or non-government organizations more appropriately, the same thing applies here. So if there are persons who want to form associations, get into corporations or corporate bodies, or cooperatives, I should say, in relation to promoting fair competition, then the commissioners are to lend their support and make themselves available there. Section 7 of the Act deals with the powers of the Commission. Now, what are these powers? So the Commission can or is empowered to summon and examine witnesses. The Commission is empowered to call for and examine documents. Remember, investigative, the Commission is empowered to administer oaths. The Commission is empowered to require that any document submitted to the Commission be verified by affidavit. And the Commission is empowered to adjourn any investigation from time to time as it sees fit. The Commission is empowered to hear orally any person who, in its opinion, will be affected by an investigation. So that's the right to be heard. Beg your pardon. Then, Commission is empowered to hear any person at the person's written request who is an interested party likely to be affected by the results of an investigation. Again, a continuation of the right to be heard. And the eighth power that the Commission has is to require a person engage in business or trade or any other person that the commission deems appropriate to state facts concerning the manufacture, production, or supply of goods or services by the person in order to determine whether the conduct of the business in relation to goods or services is a breach of the act if they are uncompetitive. So those are the functions of the commission, those are the powers of the commission, and you can also look at section 8 and 10 of the act in relation to the powers of the commission. And the ninth power is that the commission is empowered to hold public hearing, but may, whenever in the circumstances warranted, conduct private hearing. So if there are sensitive matters that are not fit for public consumption, then it can be in-camera hearing, right? So if they are matter of trade secrets or sensitive information that doesn't require the public knowledge, then yes. And then section 10 it makes it clear that the commission is empowered to require an authorized officer to enter and search premises and inspect and copy and seize documents in order to ascertain if the person is engaged in conduct in contravention of the act. So these are very wide and far-reaching powers that the commission has, and all of it is geared towards ensuring that there is fair competition in the market place. Now, section 9 gives the minister is responsible for the act and for the fair competition policy directive role, right? So the minister here can give broad directions. So it's not that the minister is going to interfere and direct the commission on a granular basis, but the minister certainly will give broad policy framework that the commission is to carry out its business in, and the commission itself will give the minister information that the minister can rely on